Part 17 of Celebrian. Oh, that last part was a bit sympathy pains. Ugh. Um, my teeth kind of went bleh. But this is sexual content, so kids under 18, sorry guys, you're gonna have to get out. Last we left off, do I really have to recap that? I'm not gonna recap that. Let's continue. One by one, the king's 12 guards came to her. For each of them she knelt on the cushion and sucked their cocks dry. The 12 orcs were all tall, strapping orcs, but their cocks varied from the simply large at 10 inches to almost as monstrous as the king's. All had the now familiar rough shaft and smooth head. After the first two, her stomach was full of semen, and she let the rest of the cum wash over her body. By the 12th one, 12 hours later, she was drenched in pints. 2 hours later, sorry guys. She was drenched in pints of cum. The cushion was soaked through, and a puddle a few feet across surrounded her. The king and most of the crowd had watched the spectacle of the elf bitch with the huge tits servicing the king's guard, but Celebrian had been oblivious to most of the commotion and calls after the few minutes. It had become back-breaking, jaw-aching work supporting both her great breasts while draining each of the long chickens, but the lack of teeth had made the work easier. When she finished the 12 blowjobs, the king let her take her throne next to his. In the following hour, a few orcs came before the king on miscellaneous business, while slaves, human and females, served the two of them food and drink. Celebrian's stomach was still full of goo, so she took little for herself. She gummed her blackroot instead with her toothless mouth. After a while, she was rested enough to notice the slaves. They had been ill-used, as could be expected. All had their breasts enlarged like Celebrian's, although none were quite as huge as she was. One, a dark-haired girl with empty eyes, had 4 rings piercing through each great teat, and 4 chains running between each. Other rings pierced her labia, from which heavy weights hung, stretching her nether lips 6 inches. She had more rings in her nose and lips, so it looked to Celebrian that breathing and drinking must be a challenge for the poor girl. A second girl had her nose somehow enlarged to the size of a pendulous apple. A little teat had been teased from the tip so that she had a third breast on her face. What? The most interesting girl to Celebrian was the one with tattoos all over her body. These were not geometrical or simply markings, but instead were detailed, well-drawn images of penises and breasts, women being fucked by orcs, giants, and animals. A tattoo under the woman's left breast was arranged so that it looked like a penis driving into a mouth as her breast bobbed with her walk. She noticed that many of the tattoos were arranged so that the motion of her buttocks, eyelids, jaws, and breast animated little scenes of depravity. How quaint. After the break, the 12 guard orcs returned, and each fucked her first in the pussy and then in the ass. This process took longer, as many of the guards did not have the king's stamina. She was able to chew her blackroot all the while, since her mouth was not occupied that afternoon. In the evening, she returned to the king's side, except for when she gave him 2 blowjobs. The next morning, the 12 returned again. She prepared to begin the process of giving them blowjobs, but the king had his attendants bring a sloat table. She leaned back into it, and the guards proceeded to fuck her long, fat breasts. This was something new for her, and arousing at first, although she tired of it halfway through. In the afternoon, she was again surprised when 12 wargs were brought to her. "What is the meaning of this, my king?" she asked. "You agreed to service all the males in my guard. Each of my guards rides a male warg." She shuddered. "Do you not defy the king, my little cocksucker? Surely not." She shook her head. Of course not, she thought. She was far beyond resistance. She walked to the first warg. His yellow eyes had cold animal hunger in them. The warg would just as happily devour her as let her service him. Slowly she reached for his neck. His fur was rough and wiry. She began to stroke him, running her hands down his great length. The warg was as large as a large horse, with shoulders as high as her own. She glanced to check his cock and could not see it. She let her breast rub along the warg. That produced a reaction. She could see the red tip of his member protrude from its sheath. Gaining confidence, she reached for his balls and fondled them while whispering her slut names into his ear. She lisped with her missing teeth, but the warg seemed to understand all the same. Whether it was the words or the fondling, the warg's cock soon reached full length. It was an impressive 18 inches, but narrow, less than 2 inches, and a smooth, bright red. Taking her pillow for her knee, she knelt by the warg, took its cock in her mouth, and quickly brought him to climax. His seed was thinner and more bitter than orc seed, but interesting all the same. She swallowed most of it and called for the next one. After taking the 12 wargs in her mouth, she took each in her pussy. The next day, she took them in her ass, then titty fucked a lot of them. She was getting proficient at mass fucking and finished the wards by lunch. How very efficient of her. She was not terribly surprised to find that the 12 guards also had a warhorse. That afternoon and the next morning she serviced the 12 horses. Unlike the warg's cock, she found the horses suitably large, almost too large for any of her orifices. But although she ached, by the end she managed to satisfy all with mouth, pussy, ass, and tits. At lunch after the horses, she noticed that her belly was quite full and swollen with horse cum. Over the last few days she had managed to take more and more of the semen into her stomach. At this morning's titty fuck with the horses, she had of course missed most of the horse's copious load, but she had managed to swallow several quarts. It gave her a fat little belly nestled between her big breast. She was, of course, covered in head to toe in semen, and mounds of it matted into her long silver hair. When food was brought, she nibbled at some of the softened carrots and realized that the black root she had chewed as much as possible over the last few days had caused her once bony gums to get fleshy. They weren't plump or swollen. Instead, ribbons of fat flesh had formed that ran along her gums, so that she had almost had a smaller set of gums. They cushioned her mouth nicely and seemed to make all the more inviting of cocks of any size and owner. When she gave the king a lunchtime blowjob, he also noticed her new gums. "Very nice, cocksucker. Time for your new teeth. I don't care for the look of your face when you gum your jaws." That afternoon an ancient female worked with her to size a pair of wooden teeth. Celebrian thought that the wooden teeth would be worse than none at all, but let her do her work. The female left with the teeth. The next morning she expected to find the 12 guards also had 12 pigs or chickens or some other such beast to be serviced, but instead she found that her day was relatively idle. She had only to service the king twice with her mouth, and a few more times with ass and pussy. She welcomed the rest and enjoyed spending the day watching the king at his business, while fondling her breasts, pussy, and nipples. She brought herself to climax in front of the king and his orcs many times, using her fingers or her dildo necklace. On the following day, her servicing of the king's guard resumed. She learned in the next week that at least while the king's forces were in camp, her life was to consist of an orc day, a warg day, a horse day, and a day of rest. She and her 36 charges soon developed the routine necessary to service each set in a day, but it did take her 10 hours each day of hard exercise. After a few weeks, the elder orc female returned with her teeth. To her surprise and pleasure, Celebrian found that the wooden form had been used to craft magical ivory teeth that slipped over her by now very fleshy gums and give her a nice, nearly real set of teeth that she could even chew tough orc meat with. In the months to come, she grew into her role in several ways. First, she learned to enjoy the role of queen, and the honor the orcs showed her, even the she-orcs. Second, she had grown to be quite the nymphomaniac and enjoyed the days of sucking and fucking. She learned to wear her crusty suit of jizz by day's end with pride, as well as enjoying the feeling of a belly swelled by a quart of jizz. But more noticeably, from a literal growth point of view, she found her pussy quite enlarged by the horses. Her ass was also deeply sunken and stretched. Even her breasts were transformed by the daily action, so that the inner side that clasped the 36 cocks every 4 days was shiny and the skin stretched. These changes were nothing to Celebrian but badges of honor, tokens of her hard work. The king eventually had her clench a weight in her pussy and ass when it was not otherwise filled, so that at least her muscles were tight, and she could still adequately pleasure the guards and wargs. But otherwise the weeks passed into months, and then into years. In time, the Orc King died, and she was married as queen to the next king. Kings came and went in the dreamlike blur of her elvish life. Over the decades, a ritual arose around her marriage to each king involving protracted sucking and fucking, baths and jizz, and even more elaborate jewelry. Like the tattooed slave, now long dead, she came to have pornographic pictures drawn all over her body. There was a great knobby cock spurting semen on one huge breast, twats, mouths, and cocks all over her body, many seeming to fuck when her breasts or other body parts moved. Even her eyelids had mouths that sucked cock when she blinked. With the passage of kings and her growing proficiency, the king's guard had grown to 24, all chosen for the size of her cocks. Her days were quite long, but she could service each set of orcs, wargs, and horses in a day still. It was non-stop fucking, but she enjoyed it. From captured elves, she learned that Elrond had survived Rene's attack, and that the elvish story was that she could not bear Middle-earth life, and had fled across the sea. It was a lie many times over, not the least because she revelled in the depravity and decadence of her life in the Orc Warrens. After more centuries, she became accepted as the ruler, the unchanging center of the Orc Warrens. She was too busy servicing the king's guard to really rule. But she was accorded first honors and consulted at the import decisions. Her servicing of the guard she could, of course, have dispensed with, but she enjoyed it far too much. And we're going to stop there. We only have one part left. Yes, I'm so excited to get this over with. See you then.